Well, I want to first thank everybody for coming out. Such a beautiful day. You could be outside playing, gardening, whatever you do on beautiful days, and you decided to come in here and spend it with us. So I'm very happy to see you all. I am Kathy Kanauer, Penfield Town Historian, and I have some other people that I'd like to introduce. First of all, the Local History Room Advisory Committee. Without the committee doing all of the behind-the-scenes work, we just wouldn't have the history room in the fashion that we have it. Hopefully I'll remember everyone. We have Anna Bunshu is here, Jay Thompson, could you guys stand up so everyone can see you? Marjorie Salmon, Carolyn Wise, Jan Brayman, and we also have Don Nelson Nasca on the committee. I don't believe he's here today. And Linda Cole, who is on the town board, is our liaison. I'd like to also introduce to you Ann Stevens, who is our editor. If it wasn't for Ann, this book would not have gotten finished. And there's two good things that came out of hiring Ann to this book. The first thing is the book, of course. The other thing is Ann and I have become very good friends. We didn't know each other at all before this, so it's really, it's been great working with her. I'd also like to introduce Amy Shalmano, who is the designer who did the layout work, so that's what makes the book so beautiful. She created a work of art. It's really very nice. I'd like to thank the Penfield supervisor and the town board for their help in getting this book published. And I think the only town board member I see here again is Linda Cole, who is the liaison for our committee. We undertook doing this as a project for the Penfield Bicentennial in 2010. We thought we were starting plenty early to have it finished for that. I started transcribing in 2006. It took about a year to get the transcription done the way I wanted it. And we've hit a lot of bumps in the road. I'll just say that and leave it at that. But we persevered and we got it done. So we were given the book and some of the other artifacts, the original diary, and some of the other artifacts from Linda and Clement Kahn, who are, Linda's a descendant of Calvin Owen. They have a huge house near Chicago, and they have a lot of family artifacts in there. And so the ones that were pertinent to Penfield, they decided to pass along to us. After the speakers are finished, if you'd like to come up and take a look at the artifacts, we brought them out for you to see. The only thing I ask is that you don't touch the originals. A couple of them I have copied and indexed so that researchers can use them, and you're free to look through those as much as you'd like. And at this time, I'm going to introduce Cynthia Houk. Cynthia is a great-great-granddaughter of Calvin Owen. And she's going to come up and talk to you about the family and her interest in the book, I believe.
Some of us come to our professions through anything but a straight line. And the reason I'm standing here is not only because Calvin happens to be my great-great-grandfather. Even my background as my collegiate degree shouldn't be having. But I should have known, as any of you others in the rooms, I have some colleagues here. Those of us that work with historic buildings and preservation and architecture, we never come to this profession directly, but we've been in training since we were in diapers. This book has had longer, if you think elephants take a long time to birth babies after 2 years, this book has had 4 decades of discussion. And here is one of the reasons. The wonderful Maud Frank and her predecessor, Kay Thompson, who all knew about this book. It was Kay Thompson who came to me when I worked at my office and said, "Oh, you know about Calvin Owen?" I said, "Well, yeah, he's my great-great-grandfather." She said, "You know about the diary?" And that famous sentence opened a whole new discussion that I had no idea of this diary existence. It was with another branch of the family in New Hampshire, and for years at the Landmark Society, after Kay retired, and Maud Frank took over, I was always saying to Maud, what happens if that woman that has a diary drops over dead in a street and nobody will know? They'll throw this out and we'll lose it, because the only thing you had in Penfield was a very primitive Xerox copy done way back in the 1960s, because somebody that Kay knew worked in the lab at Xerox, and they were inventing xerography, and he made this really primitive bluish, very faded copy. We knew the original was in New Hampshire, and then it got to Chicago. Well, that woman who had the directory, or the diary, is my third cousin, Linda, who also has 3 bedrooms full of family letters and memorabilia, portraits none of us ever knew about. And Linda in 1999 made the best phone call I've ever heard of. She called Maud and said, I'd like to give all these materials to the town of Penfield. Now, there are other relatives in the room equally interested in Calvin. And if my cousins Jeanette and Dick and Craig, and did I miss anybody, could put their hands up. There's other, and my sister Heather, she's looking at me horrified. There are lots of relatives running around Monroe, Western New York, but there are also many other relatives all over the country that none of us know about. But thank goodness Linda got back to us and brought these magnificent treasures back to Penfield. There he is, photograph when he's looking kind of old. This is a man that his diary, as I think Chris Clark, who's in the room a long time ago, who got to see this, said it was like he had a historian sitting next to him going, tell us about the Know-Nothing Party, tell us about abolition, tell us about temperance. As he was writing this diary, I mean, he was really telling all these different things that historians want to know and sometimes go, I don't care about the weather on that date. Why didn't he write about Lincoln's assassination? Well, he does mention all these different things. And we even have a picture of his mother, which is in the book. She's buried out at Oakwood Cemetery. All these folks are just next door at Oakwood. And there they are. Not only what you are getting with the diary, but some of my colleagues who work with historic buildings thirst after having a copy. And that is Calvin's ledger, where he tells everything he bought, loaned, rented. He can tell you how many panes of glass cost something, if he rented his sleigh to somebody for the day so they could go over to Brockport and back. That is in the ledger, which is not the book you're seeing today. So these are magnificent documents of a regular guy, not somebody who was the President of the United States or a state senator, but he had his fingers in a lot of different pies, and he had a fabulously interesting life because of this variety. And he lived over an amazing period from 1798, Washington was still alive, to 1883, when we had the canal was on its way out and rails were on their way in, and Rochester was a city of almost 300,000 people. So you can try to get the sense of what he experienced over his lifetime is really just dazzling. These are some of the artifacts Linda's brought back. So when Calvin got here, this is the sort of thing he saw. He was a teenager. He came to this area and he said, oh, Penfield's going to be the center of the universe, and that little mud hole with all those mosquitoes, Rochesterville, that's a big nothing. Nothing's going to happen up there. Well, not everybody's always right, but that water power was one of the reasons in the fertile lands that everyone was coming here. And to get here from Albany at this time period was a 30-day trek overland. There was just one road that went from Albany out here. And most people like traveling in the winter because it was frozen, it was easier to travel. This mud season, forget it, they didn't want to come here. So 30 days from the east coast, because most people did live within 50 miles of the Atlantic. Here is a portrait that was done of the downtown falls. This is what Calvin would have seen. This was done by one of the French royal family who was visiting, coming through here. It was sort of the big adventure, not to go to California or even the Midwest. Where you're sitting today, this was the Wild West in the 1790s, 1810s, and 20s. This was like the edge of the earth. And that's what downtown Rochester looked like. Just lots of trees and a lot of noisy water. But that's what all the entrepreneurs were thrilled about. Water power to run the mills, and this cheap, fertile land that they could get for a few cents an acre. This is a little cleaned up. I don't think everybody's log cabin looked quite this glamorous, but probably this is what something Calvin would have lived in originally, very simple dwelling. And he didn't have quite these luxurious accommodations with a stagecoach that looks like something out of a Jane Austen novel. It was a lot more rigorous traveling out here to where you're sitting today. Mr. Penfield was already here. We still have the Penfield house. It's a little bit remodeled, but it's there right in the four corners of the hamlet, because we really don't have a village in Penfield. You do not have an incorporated village. It's a hamlet. And there's a lot left today that harkens back to what Calvin and his family knew and saw at that time period. Arundequoit Creek drops 25 feet in just like a half a mile or something, and there were 25 mills located down there on Lincoln's Mills. You can see it today when you go to what was linear is now Channing Philbrick Park, but this is tucked away. Not a lot of people know about this. This beautiful house, right overlooking Lincoln Mills, the previous building on the site, Calvin lived there. No, he didn't have this upscale house, but this is the miller's house that after the big flood in 1920, this is about all that was left of this huge milling empire just down the road at Linden and 5 Mile Line. Other success stories. This is now offices, but here's another miller's house. You all drive past this on Penfield Road. Why is it so big? They made a lot of money in the milling business along Arundequoit Creek. And there are still mills, amazingly. And what is Ellison Park? This was the last operating flour mill in Monroe County, right up until 1971 or 72. Daisy Flour Mill still was grinding flour, even though the flour and wheat industry had really left Rochester, Western New York by the 1860s and 70s and headed on out to the Midwest, where it's still a wheat basket. And inside, when it became a restaurant, here is what a real flour mill looks like that was water-powered up until the mid-late 19th or 20th century. So this was a very common type building. We still have one left, and it's down in Ellison Park. What did Calvin see in this community that's still visible today? Well, he came about 1815. He was a teenager. He would have seen houses like this, Federal style, the first such construction. You could make bricks in the area because this house next to Strawberry Hill is made of brick, and it's got that lovely Federal style fan. So, and the interior of this house still has some original stenciling that's quite wonderful. So here's a building Calvin would have seen. He also saw some things he wasn't too thrilled about. Taverns were often at the Stone Tolan House, which is a museum. It's the oldest building in Monroe County. And somebody said, ooh, Stone's Tavern. No, it wasn't like Holiday Inn. It basically said this family was trusting enough that they would let you throw some blankets on the floor, stay overnight indoors, not out in the woods, and you could get something to eat and drink in a tavern room, because the consumption of alcohol in the United States at this period was magnificently higher than any of you could possibly dream about. Because again, water sources were often not you couldn't trust them. You had to worry about diseases and were they polluted with things that were going to kill you. But this became a big topic, as Kathy mentioned earlier. Calvin became a water-only guy, and for some very good reasons that sometimes still resonate in the 21st century. So a number of comments that you'll see, and he's not politically correct. There is somebody who passes away in town, and I think the verbiage in his diary or something like, well, John Smith passed away. Well, what can you expect? He was a drunkard. This is not terribly sympathetic, but it reflects his thoughts on that topic. Downtown Rochester, lots of mills, lots of water, lots of opportunity, and of course Rochesterville, the village, booms into a city in the 1820s and becomes from 3,000 to 30,000, not only because of the mills and the water power and the agriculture, but the Erie Canal. And likewise, Penfield, of course, did not have the canal. You would always have to go to Fairport to get the canal or the rail, and he does mention that in the diary. It was just a little bit down the road. But Calvin would have seen Federal-style buildings like this is at the Four Corners on 5 Mile Line Road. He would have seen the Hip House over by Hip Brook. This is another Greek revival house from that time period, 1830s, 40s. Calvin would have seen many churches, and he would have seen cobblestone buildings going up, though I don't know, do you have one in the town of Penfield? But there were many others, and he traveled more than you might have thought. He liked to work with his hands. And my colleague Steve Jordan informed me that Calvin was not just a carpenter, he was a carpenter joiner, which meant, Steve, he constructed buildings, correct? This was a higher level of carpentry skills. He wasn't just doing doors and railings. And in working with his hands, we don't know if he ever did masonry, but he certainly did carpentry, and in his diary it is mentioned, and even more thoroughly in his ledger book, he lists all these projects around town, whether it was putting up a new church or putting in a railing at somebody's house. They're all listed and what he charged them. And of course, the prices then today look like the bargain of the year. This is one of his buildings, the Methodist Church at the Four Corners in the hamlet. This is still there today. It is now a church again. He was also a member. His mother, Lucy, and his wife, Clarissa, were members, and this was Methodist, so temperance was, no alcohol was a big part of their theology. But this is one of the buildings that he constructed that we can still see today, Greek Revival style. Now, ironically that my cousin Craig Foreman is here, one time when I went to his parents' house and looked over the mantle and I said, "Oh, you've got a picture of the Methodist Church at the Four Corners of Penfield." They said, yes, a family friend, and this is it's not that painting, but a similar painting by Milton Holm, a very fine local painter. And I said to my cousin Nancy Howk Foreman, I said, well, I know your parents' friend Milt painted the painting. I said, but do you know that our great-great-grandfather actually built that church? She had no idea. So that was a real irony that here in her living room, over the mantel, is this building, a painting she's had for decades, but had no idea that her family was in any way connected to it. He also helped build the academy. Yes, tucked behind all of those additions where your fire hall is an academy, which is their version of a junior high or high school. So that's another one of his projects. This happens to be of brick. This is the house that I had the biggest surprise when I visited in the 80s, and Mark, and I can't remember his last name, lived there. Pardon? Myers. Yes, thank you. Mark Myers invited a group from the Landmark Society to come, and he showed me the front, beautiful handrail and balusters, and then showed me the entry in Calvin's ledger. He said, this is what your great-great-grandfather did in this house after it was built. It's a very early federal-style house. And here we're standing in front of the same railing and balusters, and I could see, like $5 for the railing and $2 for the supplies. So that's the kind of, he also did add-ons and improvements, even to a house that was maybe less than 10 or 15 years old. So this is a Penfield landmark. It's the Rich Nman house. When I was a child, this had not been painted for many decades, and my parents drove by this multiple times. My mother would have loved to have had this house. My father's idea of renovation was not a project this daunting. So all those years later, to actually walk inside and then find out I had a family connection to some of this beautiful woodwork was really quite nice. This is where Calvin, his wife, and some of the kids lived. He didn't build the house. This is the Owen House. It's now owned by Doug McCord, who's a landscape architect, and I finally got in this building within the last year. Calvin had something that not many people had in those days, a lot of books. Books were very expensive. And this little white one-story bump-out addition, he did add to this existing building. This was his library, that you on the frontier had your library with multiple books in this time period was quite extraordinary. There was no Amazon and Google and Barnes & Noble you could run to or book sales. Yes. Oh, there's why you look familiar. I haven't seen you that often. There is the current owner. Now, when Doug let me in the house, I was so thrilled to see the building, and Steve, they are original sash and muntins. You'll be pleased to hear that. But another thrilling surprise was the kitchen's in the basement, and there's a bake oven and fireplace down there, which I didn't know about, but took pictures and sent them. We have a local woman, Linda Lucio, who is the expert on this, and she had never seen this particular building, and I hope she's possibly come or going to come visit. So that was another thrill, going in the basement and seeing that the original bake oven, the fireplace and bake oven are still intact in this house where Calvin lived from the 1850s, roughly, when he bought the house, till his death in 1883, and it would continue in the family for at least another generation or two. Because I think my dad, who was born 1918, made some vague comment about, yeah, we visited cousins here when he was a little kid, but I had never stepped foot in the house. Calvin would have seen a lot of water. The Great Lakes were here, and the river was here, but the canal wasn't. But the canal was built, and now you could get that 30-day trip, 4 days, Rochester to Albany. Whole lot different than going overland on routes 5 and 20. So Calvin would have seen this. This is an 1838 view of downtown Rochester with the first Erie Canal aqueduct going across, and then they had to rebuild it quickly because it was not big enough and it was falling apart. And we see that today, the bottom arches. And up to here is the 1842 Erie Canal aqueduct that was drained about 1920, and they put on that upper deck when Broad Street was created. Calvin would have also been able to see that life in downtown Rochester wasn't quite so rustic as he had predicted. Here's the church that Colonel Rochester built in the 1820s, still there today as an Episcopal church, the oldest public building in Rochester, St. Luke's and St. Simon Serene Episcopal Church on Fitzhugh Street, right next to what would have been the canal. And this is the place that Calvin said just would never go anywhere. Here is an aerial view of Rochester in the 1850s, a big, booming city, where Penfield stayed a town and an agricultural center and thrived, but never was the center of the universe. Here, just 10 years later, here's an aerial view of Rochester in the 1860s, and there's that waterfall you saw earlier that looked like the wilderness with only trees around it. In a period of less than 7 decades, this is what the wilderness became. Rochester, New York, a huge, very thriving city. Other things that Calvin would have seen would have been federal-style houses remodeled with Italianate cupolas and front porches, probably a remodel in the 1870s or 80s. He would have also seen the very interesting mud house at 1000 Wayland Road. That's from the 19th century. And Calvin would have seen the first high school in downtown Rochester, 1872, built on Fitzhugh Street. Some of you probably remember this as the Board of Education. It's about to open as apartments. It's being renovated as we speak. So Calvin got to see this amazing breadth of development in history. A mud hole with mosquitoes becomes a huge city, Rochester, New York, next to the High Falls. He'd see it turn into a horticulture center with places like Crossman and Vick, Ellwanger and Barry. He would see the coming of the railroad, which certainly was a whole lot different than when he came here as a kid in 1815. And he would see the celebration of the U.S. Centennial in 1876, where the County of Monroe would publish a very special volume on the history of the county. And here's one of the houses that was featured in that book, Harvey Wayland's property, which you can still see today, looking pretty much the same, on Wayland Road, a really magnificent house that I don't know if Calvin had anything to do with this house, but he probably would at least have visited it. So that's Calvin's era. And some of the things that he would have seen, this is Strawberry Castle, that are still here for us today to experience because so much of what Penfield has been preserved. It's agricultural history, it's residential history, but many of those people have not really ever quite moved away. If we go next door to Oakwood Cemetery, we can see Samuel Rich, who was the milling czar along Arundecoit Creek, and his wonderful houses on 5 Mile Line Road. We can see this tombstone of John Hipp, one of the pioneers, is what his epitaph says on the stone. And we can see the 6 stones that comprise the Owen family plot, starting from right to left. Lucy and William, his parents. William was a Revolutionary War soldier from 1780 to 83. I think that's one of the children whose stone is leaning. It's now on the ground. The next 2 are Clarissa and Calvin, husband and wife. And then the last stone is their eldest son, Henry Belcher. Henry Belcher was killed in the Civil War. And this is just a little word of warning for all of you history buffs. Always check your sources. We have been running around for years talking about Henry. Here it is. My husband, Captain Henry Belcher, killed in the Battle of the Wilderness, May 10, 1864, age 34 years. His wife survived him. She remarried and moved to Illinois. They had no children, and there is no body in this grave. He was lost in battle, and I brought in some interesting flyers. I was at the battlefields in Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Spotsylvania, the Wilderness, in 97-degree heat last weekend because I was at a college reunion in Fredericksburg, and I'd never been out to these different battlefields. There was a PhD candidate working at the front desk at the National Park, and she was worth her weight in gold because she got out the official federal report that said, when she saw May 10th, she said, there's no way he was at the Wilderness battle. It had finished by the 7th. So we got out all these flyers. So this epitaph, he wasn't at Wilderness. He lived to go down the road to Spotsylvania Courthouse, which some say could be the most bloody battle. And the day he was killed was something called the Bloody Angle, where it was hand-to-hand combat, and some of the on-site descriptions are that it was absolutely the most brutal, gruesome battle of the entire war. Thousands were killed, and I figured for many years his body was simply left on the battlefield, as were others, but was told that many, many of them were brought, the anonymous bodies were brought up to Fredericksburg, Virginia, and are interred anonymously at the National Battlefield Cemetery. So we got a whole new piece of information, and I've put up some information on the wall. So any of you family researchers, always check your sources, because sometimes things I said, well, it's on their tombstone. They must be correct. Maybe. So there we are. That's what we can see today. That's what the family knows. That's what you can all enjoy, that there's more around here that Calvin had responsibility for, both on exteriors of buildings and interiors, and you will discover much of that in this book that Kathy and Ann can never be thanked enough for birthing after 40 years of discussion. And there's his house that you can go see. So thank you very much.
When I introduced Cynthia to you, I was so anxious to say that she was a descendant of Calvin's. I neglected to tell you that she's an architectural specialist with the Western New York Landmark Society. So you probably figured that out as she was speaking. I'd also like to recognize a couple who also contributed a great deal to the publication of this book, and that is George and Kay Shaw. They made a generous donation for the printing expenses. So I'd just like to recognize the Shaws, because without them, we wouldn't have this book. And while they're switching back from the slide projector back to the computer, I'm going to introduce you to Ann. She's going to come up and talk to you about some of the technical, the contents of the book, and explain how things are done in there and why they're done in that certain, the way that they are done. So this is Ann Stevens.
Thank you. Thanks, Kathy. Thanks, Cynthia, for a wonderful background talk. Can't hear me. Sorry. Thank you. Thanks to Kathy and thanks to Cynthia for giving that wonderful talk about Calvin Owen's era. We're so happy to see so many of you here to celebrate this bicentennial publication, and we hope that you, like us, feel that it's been worth the wait. I'm the lucky person whom the town hired to edit this book, and it's been truly the opportunity of a lifetime for me, and I want to thank Kathy and the town both for asking me to write this and edit it, and all the many town and church historians that helped us along the way, giving us photos to use in the book and giving us information and background about things that Calvin was talking about. We talked to people in Webster, in Bergen, Ontario County. Liz Albright is here. Down to Canandaigua and up to Webster. It was just a real community effort getting this book published. Now, I found that a lot of people wonder what an editor does. And most people probably think that, well, she's a proofreader. She reads through things and corrects grammar, spelling, and so on. That's true, but an editor also does much, much more. The job of an editor is to make the author's voice sing, to help them say what they want to say in their own voice, but effectively for the reader's advantage. It's all about facilitating communication and being the reader's advocate. And like a physician, it's our pledge to first do no harm. It's our job to honor the author's original voice. So this job was much more complicated than most. Our goal with this diary was to make it accessible to the general public. and that meant making a few key decisions. First, how do we honor the document as a historical artifact while still making it accessible to you all? Should we print the book verbatim, or should we correct his spelling errors, punctuation, and grammar, and sacrifice authenticity for legibility and comprehension? Calvin writes with a 19th century voice, which can be confusing at times, just as today's texting might confuse someone 200 years from now. His spelling was erratic, his grammar sloppy, and his punctuation often non-existent. The English language was not yet standardized at the time he wrote this, and his schooling was limited. He left school about the age of 10, sometime between the age of 10 and 13. And since the original transcription that Kathy did is always available to researchers, we had the flexibility to take some liberties with the book in order to help the reader more easily read through it. So we decided to conservatively correct only any misspelled words that we couldn't make sense of phonetically, and added punctuation only when absolutely necessary. If his statements were bumpy or confusing, words were added in brackets to allow his expression to flow. The goal was to ease the reader's way through the book. The second problem we faced was that the original journal was written in two sections: Owen's diary, which spans from his birth in 1798 until 3 weeks before his death in 1883, and his logbook, which is an in-depth record of events from 1853 through 1860, when he was age 55 through 62. So we needed to decide if we should blend the two documents chronologically as one or maintain them as two separate documents. So to avoid having the reader flip back and forth between the logbook and diary entries to see what was going on in any given day, we blended the two sections chronologically. And third, we needed to decide how to make this into a book that anyone would want to read. Because Owen's commentary is so far-reaching and varied, it doesn't really read like a narrative. So whenever Calvin Owen mentioned a person or an event that I didn't know anything about, which was most of them, I researched who or what he was talking about and added on an annotation to explain it. I then sought out photographs and illustrations from the local libraries, historians, and the Library of Congress to help bring his words to life visually. So now I'd like to take a moment to familiarize you with the contents of the book. Our graphic designer, Amy Scellamano, did an amazing job at making sense of all the many complex pieces of the puzzle that this book is, and making it into an elegant but legible book. So she created this guide to type styles. This tells you right at the beginning of the book how to navigate through this book. And what she's done, we put the logbook in black type, the diary in black type and the logbook in brown type. So even though it's chronologically laid out, you'll always know which document your text is coming from. Secondly, the historical annotations are in italics, and along with the illustrations, they'll give you information about the topics or the people that Owen discusses. And third, the year, it's not, well, it is shown there. In the top right-hand corner, you'll see the years that each page covers printed, so that as you're flipping through the book, if you're interested in a certain year, you can find it right away, because Calvin didn't always put the year in the date when he was in his diary. So next we created a timeline that gives you a shorthand reference to Calvin Owen's life from birth to death, along with some historical events to give his life some context. Then Amy created a beautiful family tree using the photographs that we had to illustrate all of Calvin Owen's relations up to his grandchildren. We had to stop somewhere. Then we created a directory of names that gives you a description of the cast of characters that are talked about in the book, whether he's related to them or not. We have his relatives and a short description about who that person was, why he was interesting, what he did in his life, who he was married to, and also people in town in Penfield that you're probably all familiar with, and how they relate to Calvin specifically. We created a list of maps to help you find what map you're looking for. For instance, Amy did a gorgeous job of making a map out of, in the next slide there, Bob, there should be a map. There we are. These are all the towns that Calvin Owen mentions in his diary where he traveled to. He was born in Ballston Spa and then traveled over into Massachusetts, down to Connecticut, and then ultimately ended up in Canandaigua. Just as a short story, they came to Canandaigua hoping to get to Buffalo to rebuild the houses that were devastated during the War of 1812. By the time they got to Canandaigua, they were told, we don't need any builders anymore. So they thought, well, geez, let's go up to Penfield because we know Henry Amsden, who had a tavern here. And subsequently, Calvin Owen actually ended up living in Amsden's tavern before it burnt down. And then finally, we made an extensive index to help researchers find topics of all sorts that they might be looking for. Now, with this book especially, I encourage you all to, I know most people don't like to read the front matter in a book. This book, I really encourage you to do so because it will help you no end in navigating through the book. Read Cynthia's foreword, read the preface and the introduction, and that will give you the background and the tools to navigate through this very complex book. It's our hope that schools and other researchers will use this book as a springboard to discover topics of interest about life in Rochester, in Penfield, and actually throughout Western New York in the 19th century and delve deeper into further research. And now we'll turn it back over to Kathy, who will tell you a little bit about what's in the book, and she'll read some of her favorite excerpts.
Calvin Owen was interested in just about everything coming and going at that time. And it's lucky for us that he was, because he recorded what he was interested in. It was almost like he was looking ahead to the future for someone to read his writings. Usually when someone has written a diary, it's personal. It's only for their own use. But just the way he wrote some of the things he wrote, you could tell he was writing for an audience. What I'm going to do is have Bob put up a picture. Well, first, I'll go through some of the buildings that he worked on quickly. This is the Phoenix building on Main Street in Pittsford. He worked on the inside of that. He worked on the Sylvanus Lathrop House on Monroe Avenue in Pittsford. He worked on the Methodist Church, the early Methodist Church in Penfield. This is the man Owen House. You saw the picture in Cynthia's slideshow, what it looks like currently. And the man in the top hat, if you can see him, is Calvin Owen, and his wife Clarissa's beside him, and their one daughter, and then two of her children. And Anne was able to, Doug also invited us to come into the house, so he's very welcoming to share the information. And I have to say, he's been a very good caretaker of this property. He invited, well, actually, Anne asked him, but he allowed us to come in to the house several years ago, and Anne took a number of photographs in the house, some of the woodworking. And one of Calvin's interests was the Temperance Movement, and this is the seal from the Penfield arm of the Temperance Movement. They were the Sons of the Rising Star. He talked about the barn burners and the hunkers. The Democratic Party in the 1840s in New York State split into two factions, one very conservative, sympathizing with the South and wanting to keep slavery, and the barn burners being very radical and wanting to do away with slavery. He recorded about the assassination of President Lincoln. And he included other local interest information. This is about a pastoral visit. It was a fundraiser for Reverend Charles Bowen, who was the minister at the time. they would have a program and hope to collect some more money for the pastor. And he wrote about technology, patents, and this is the Morse code. He wrote something about the telegraph, and he helped another Penfield resident with some of his plans for a couple things that he patented. Okay, well, this is Daniel Penfield. Most of you know that, especially if you're a Penfield resident. If you don't know that, you better come see me in the local history room. But if you're not a resident, this is Daniel Penfield. And it's interesting because he's the founder of our town, and Calvin Owen only mentions him once in the book. And I don't think he was a fan of Daniel's. But what he said was, Daniel Penfield, from whom the town derives its name, was the purchaser of the township and had only been a few years when we came in. He was selling off farms as fast as he could. He was the owner of the mills and all the water privileges, and the water power was not fully employed. Penfield did not use nor let others use the water as it should have been. And just so it was in regard to village lots, he would not sell to settlers. Therefore, that improvement of the village was not made as it might have been. If Mr. Penfield had not been a sort of dog in the manger, and dog in the manger, I had to look it up because I'd never heard that term before. It was an Aesop fable of a dog who was in a barn guarding the manger full of hay from the other animals. He wasn't letting them eat it, but he didn't want to eat it himself. He just didn't want the others to eat it. So that was his impression of Daniel Penfield. And there's the dog in the manger. He talked about entertainment, local entertainments, and event. This is Sam Patch's last jump. And this is the tightrope across the high falls. You can see the rope right along here, and then the guy wires that are holding it in place. And the reason it's duplicated is because it's one of those stereo photographs that you could look at three-dimensional through a viewer. Bob, you want to go on to the next one? This is probably my favorite quote from him in the book. It's so funny. He took it upon himself to describe women's fashion. It's in 1858, and it sounds like most any man describing women's fashion. It may amuse the curious in future times to know some of the fashions at this time, and for the benefit of such, I will say that about a year and a half ago, the females began using hoops in skirts or underclothes. The material for hoops were some of brass, some of whalebone, some of cane or rattan, and some were rope, putting it about midway of the dress. The object was to extend from the body, making the wearer look as large around as a hogshead. And at this time, it prevails among old and young generally. The only advantage derived from the fashion that I can perceive is that it does favor their walking with more freedom and ease on account of their cloths being thrown off from the legs. Drawers are worn at this time. The outer dresses are long. Some of them fall to the ground when standing, sweeping the ground as they go. The sleeves at the wrists are what is called flowing, being large enough to admit 3 or 4 wrists at the same time. And the bonnets cover about the back half of the head. He talks about health-related issues. He used tobacco for quite a while in his life, and he talks about why he gave up tobacco, but he also talks about drinking water, and this is one I wanted to be sure and read to you. In regard to all artificial drinks, most of them being more or less stimulating, are positively injurious to health. I, of course, include tea and coffee in this. There's no drink that is so conducive to good health as pure cold water. And after using these warm drinks at meals nearly all of my life, up to about 8 months ago when I ceased using them entirely, I find that my health is decidedly better for the abandonment. So that's why we're sharing the water. We want everyone to be healthy 8 months from now. He recounts a story of another Penfield resident, Calvin Clark, and his experience with drinking water. And I think that's why Calvin Clark was very, very ill, and the doctor said not to let him have any water. And there were 2 watchers sitting up with him at night. and they both fell asleep. And Calvin Clark woke up, went over and was drinking water out of the bucket, and knocked the bucket over or something. He made a commotion, woke the watchers up, and then one of them went to get the doctor because he'd given them strict orders that he wasn't to have any water. And the doctor came and said, well, you might as well let him drink as much as he wants because he's going to be dead by morning. And so they did that, and by morning, his fever was gone. So you can see Calvin Owen didn't know what it was about the water that was curing or that was helpful, but all he knew was that it helped Calvin Clark. This is about patent medicines. He has his opinion on that, too. He thinks the doctors are to be avoided at all costs. Again, he talked about temperance, and he was a big part of the temperance group in town. He talked about politics and the Know Nothing Party. And he talked about the Civil War to one extent. And Cynthia was talking to you about his son, Henry Belcher, who was killed in the Battle of Spotsylvania, or the Battle of the Wilderness. And Calvin Owen learned about that by reading it in the newspaper, which is just very shocking to us today, but that there was no cell phones, there was no email, there were telegrams but he didn't get a telegram, he read it in the newspaper. I'm not going to read any more of these to you at this point. I think it's getting very hot in here, and I think that we've been sitting long enough. So I hope that you enjoy reading the book and learning about our area and in the 19th century. Thank you for coming out. And does anybody have any questions before we break up?
We thank you very much.
Well, thank you for coming out again. Have some refreshments. Look at the artifacts. Look at the books.